to begin this discussion, we're very fortunate to have somebody that U.S. Labor Against the War has a long relationship with, and that's Phyllis Bennis. And there aren't a lot of people who have the sort of wealth of history and experience to understand the Middle East, both the struggle in Iraq, but the broader role of the Middle East in the whole world political agenda. And as we see right now, this is sort of the crux of where the rubber meets the road right now in terms of international politics. We've got to understand it. We have to understand it to be able to make intelligent decisions, to decide who to vote for, right? Something so basic as that. And we're not going to learn it on CNN, unfortunately. And we're not going to learn it in our newspapers. And our kids, unfortunately, are not going to learn it in their schools yet. But we got to figure out other ways. And there's a lot of sources out there. And we need to make an effort to educate ourselves. One of them is Phyllis's book, Challenging Empire. And it's how people, governments, and the UN defy U.S. power. Part of what's important to understand is that the rest of the world doesn't see things the way we do here in the United States. We see we're like a little bit of, I don't know, is it Copernicus who thought that the sun revolved around the earth? But it really, the world does not revolve around the United States. In fact, there's billions of people in the world. Most of them don't live here. Right? I'm just trying to get some facts, you know what I mean? And so they see things very differently. And so this is a really very useful piece. And Phyllis works for the Institute for Policy Studies. She also wears a whole bunch of other hats. She's really a street fighter. She's also an educator. She's somebody who brings a lot of expertise to the issue of Iraq and to the issue of the Middle East. Has made a tremendous contribution just by giving people and giving working class people good, useful information that we can then know what we're talking about when we talk to other folks. So I want to, with pleasure, I want to introduce Phyllis Bennis.
Well, thank you all for being here, for coming today, for being part of U.S. Labor Against the War, for being part of this amazing anti-war movement that is still growing and still taking shape. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of this today. Well, thank you all for being here, for coming today, for being part of U.S. Labor Against the War, for being part of this amazing anti-war movement that is still growing and still taking shape. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of this today. But I got to tell you, I want to start with a complaint. You know, it's an interesting question that Jean was talking about why should workers be talking about Iraq? Why should workers be talking about this? And just when I came in early this morning, I missed last night's session, but I went up to my room to put my bag away and turned on CNN, of course, you know we do that, just for a hot second, and I actually learned something. I mean, we have, let me just say, as an anti-war movement, we have managed to change public opinion in this country profoundly enough already that every once in a while you even hear some real news on CNN. And not often, but what I heard was actually quite shocking and horrifying. A new study from Harvard indicates that the war has already cost over $1 trillion. And that if it stopped today, the cost would continue to spiral close to $2 trillion. Because not only the cost of these high-tech weaponry and et cetera, but the health care. At a time when the Veterans Administration, according to CNN's report of the Harvard study, is running $2 to $3 billion per year in deficit, the Veterans Administration. that taking care of our soldiers who have come home is costing unimaginable figures. That is already at $1 trillion for the war. So if anyone wants to know why we should be talking about it, that's not a bad place to start. The cost of war to every state, to every city. You know, the elections, certainly, I think most of us greeted them with relief, if not excitement. It was a relief that there is the potential for public pressure to force some greater change. Not relief that these guys are on their own going to make the changes, but relief that there might be enough of a shift that we might be able to have a little more influence than we have so far. And that's, I think, very important. But the question of what it means to say there's going to be a change puts a huge responsibility on us. You know, I think most of us looking around the room, not everybody's old enough, but a lot of people here are old enough to know that in the 8 years of the Clinton administration, we spent those years in the streets, protesting the impact of sanctions in Iraq, protesting the bombing in Iraq. I'm just talking about Iraq here. I mean, aside from all of the domestic issues that we had to fight for in all those years, and we have to fight for now. But one of the things that emerged with this war was the rise of something that the New York Times itself was forced to acknowledge is now being called the second superpower. And from the beginning, labor was a fundamental part of that second superpower. How many of you were in the streets on February 15, 2003, the day the world said no to war? Almost everybody in this room. 500,000 of us in front of the United Nations in New York, another 250,000 in San Francisco. People demonstrating, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, between 12 and 14 million people, the largest demonstration ever held in the history of humanity. Now, granted, they say in the history of mankind, but okay. But it was an amazing day because not only were there people marching all over the world, beginning in Southeast Asia and in Australia and even in Antarctica, the entire population of a continent was in the streets that day. The 13 scientists in Antarctica, all of them came out and they took a picture. They took a helicopter, they rescued a helicopter up, and they took a picture of them having stomped out a peace sign in the snow and holding signs saying Antarctica says no to war. It was an amazing moment. But what I want to say is that what was so amazing about that, and the reason I think that the New York Times was forced to do what they almost never do, which is to tell the truth on the front page above the fold, they admitted, their words were, there are once again two superpowers in the world, the United States and global public opinion. That was huge. But it was more than a soundbite. It was more than a soundbite, because what they were referring to was not only the people marching in the streets, led in many, many countries by trade unionists, by workers, but it was because there was enough power in the streets that day, and in the work leading up to it, that governments had been forced to say no to U.S. pressure to join the war. And eventually there were enough governments that the United Nations was forced to do what its charter says it's supposed to do, but it almost never gets to do, which is to say no to the scourge of war. That three-part coalition, if you will, of global opposition to this war of empire, that's what made that day so extraordinary. That's what created that second superpower. And labor, organized labor, trade unions, and unorganized labor, has been at the center of that movement ever since. It's for that reason that the role of U.S. labor against the war has been so important in our anti-war movement here. The relationships that have been created between U.S. labor against the war and the trade unions that you all represent, and the Iraqi oil workers unions, for instance, the first real relationships with Iraqis that was built in this country after the war, after the invasion. This has provided a model for the rest of the anti-war movement. This is what has made it so extraordinary. Now, so that's a lot of the reasons about why we talk about the war. So then the question is, well, how do we talk about the war? Now, one of the other sort of why, how issues is failure. Look at who's talking about it. Look at the Sunday morning talk shows. Look at the pundits. Look at the Baker-Hamilton report, which I'll get to in a few minutes. Talk about failures. I mean, these are the people who are supposed to be the ones talking about it. The talking heads, the think tanks, the academics, the intellectuals, the Congress. Boy, have they failed. We are looking right now at a moment where the good side is pretty much everybody is acknowledging this is no longer America's moment in the Middle East. Now, some of us, granted, look, all right, so we all knew he never was, but come on, give me some slack here. People around this country believed for the first couple of years that this was our moment. We overthrew a dictator. We're bringing democracy. We're spreading democracy from Iraq to the rest of the region. There's going to be elections in Palestinian territories. There's going to be elections in Iraq. There's going to be elections in Lebanon. There's going to be elections in Egypt. Oops. Well, okay, we don't like what happened so much in all those elections. All right, but what's clear is that now it has become really inescapable, and no one except the very tightest core of the Bush administration is really trying to deny it anymore. The U.S. is no longer on the ascendancy in the Middle East. That's huge, because they've been on the ascendancy for a really long time. So this is a huge shift. They are on the descendancy. We are looking at a legacy of failure that is going to be seen and felt and heard for generations. Iraq is shattered. Iraqis are dying. Palestine remains occupied and under assault, and Palestinians are hungry, are imprisoned in tiny cantons. Israel is divided, and Israelis are frightened. Lebanon is splitting apart, and the Lebanese are angry. This is what U.S. democratization has brought to the Middle East. This is not anything that anybody in Washington these days is very proud of. And this means that it's a moment for us to ratchet up our work to unimaginable levels. Because this is the moment when their failure is now clearer than it's ever been. And we have to be the ones to say, okay, we're going to be the ones to roll up our sleeves and get to work to craft a different policy. An entirely different policy. When we talk about the failures of their policy, we're also talking about why there was such a big shift in the elections a few weeks ago. But it has everything to do with why those elections were votes against and not votes for. It was votes against this war, this administration, this policy of a drive for unilateralism and militarism and empire. That's what people were voting against. In a few places, people had the opportunity to vote for really good candidates. But there weren't very many of them. Most of them were just not that. And that's why people voted for them. Now, being not that is important. I don't want to diminish that. But it isn't enough. We have to make it into something. So the question then becomes, how do we redefine this period? How do we look at the Middle East now? And this is where I think it is important that we really understand how to talk about the Middle East. The Middle East today has everything to do with U.S. policy. Whether it's Israel-Palestine, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Iran, whether it's Lebanon, the whole region is reflecting U.S. failures. So what are we seeing in Iraq? We're seeing rising militarism on the part of the U.S. There's still talk about sending more troops, and even the military saying, where the hell do you think we're going to get them? you know? 20,000 more to stabilize Baghdad. Oh, that's a real good idea. You know, because the bottom line that we have to keep in mind when people say, you know, I'll just tell you one story. A few weeks ago, I was on the Lara NewsHour. This is, you know, they were doing this series of one-on-one interviews with people about what should happen in Iraq. So, for whatever fluke of a reason, they started with me, and I started with, it's easy, get out, right? And then the question becomes, we have accomplished a great deal in public opinion. 65% of Americans now believe the war was wrong from the beginning, should be ended now. But even among those Americans, an awful lot are still kind of afraid to say, and therefore, the answer is, duh, bring the troops home. Stop the occupation. Bring the mercenaries home. Stop paying money that should go to Iraqi compensation and instead paying it to Halliburton. This is not brain surgery. It doesn't take rocket scientists. So, but we do have to talk about why. And so what the first question was, when I went on the Lara NewsHour, was, how, are you saying that all the troops should just come home? And I said, yeah. Because as long as the troops are there, they are the cause of the violence, not the answer to the violence. They're not the response to the violence. They have proved themselves unable, whether they wanted to or not is not the issue. They have proved themselves unable to protect Iraqi civilians from the rising violence, their own and the sectarian violence that has ripped apart Iraqi society. Ripped it apart in response to the occupation by U.S. troops. U.S. troops that are stationed there are the problem, not the solution in Iraq. And they have got to be brought home. So that's, I think, the starting point. You know, there's a lot of sound bites. People are always looking for sound bites on this. You'll remember Colin Powell's sound bite about the Pottery Barn analogy. We broke it, we have to fix it. Well, it was kind of nice he agreed that, yes, the United States was responsible for destroying Iraq. It would have been nice if he included the 13 years of crippling economic sanctions that had destroyed so many lives, killed 500,000 children before the invasion even happened. But okay, we won't hold him to that account. But he said, this is our obligation. It's like Pottery Barn. We broke it, we have to fix it. Well, here's the soundbite on the other side. Iraq is not a cop. And the American soldiers are not a tube of crazy poo. If we want an analogy, we look at the bull in the china shop. What happens when the bull gets loose in the china shop and breaks all the dishes? You don't leave the bull in the china shop and say, now will you please fix the dishes? You get the bull out of the china shop and try to check his family. We have to keep the focus because the debate is changing. The debate is changing, and this is very important. Nobody is now allowed to say, stay the course. That's huge. That doesn't mean they're not proposing stay the course like, or stay the almost course. But it's important that they acknowledge that staying the course is no longer a viable option. This is no longer a viable slogan, at least. It's up to us to say, it's also not a viable strategy. And saying that we're going to redeploy so-called combat brigades to permanent bases instead of in the cities, leaving 70,000 others, including rapid response troops. Now, if they're not combat brigades, what are they? Leaving behind logistics forces and kind of the reverse of Vietnam. Did you all catch this? This is so weird. Vietnam starts with years of gradually escalating numbers of trainers, quote, that are embedded. They didn't call it that then, but that's what they were. They were trainers embedded with the South Vietnamese puppet army. And when that didn't work, the U.S. sent it, did a coup, sound familiar, did a coup in South Vietnam, and then sent in hundreds of thousands of ground troops. And oops, that didn't work either. At the end of the day, we lost anyway. In Iraq, we're looking at the opposite. They start with invasions of hundreds of thousands of ground troops. I heard today that it's now almost 1 million troops have been in Iraq, circulating through, not at one time, but it's now almost 1 million troops that have been there. Now they're talking about scaling back to a different kind of occupation. Smaller, leaner, these descriptions that Rumsfeld liked to talk about, right? A different kind of occupation. Maybe this one will work. So what's this one going to look like? Well, from what we can tell, I'm guessing 2 or 3 brigades will be brought home, great fanfare, parades, so that we forget about the fact that a number of other brigades are still in Iraq, maybe taken out of the cities and sent to these permanent U.S. bases being built in Iraq. How convenient is that? Now, there's a little inconvenient fact that Congress actually, in their one good thing, did pass a law last year saying no money for permanent bases. Hello. What happened? They're still being built. The money is somewhere emerging somewhere. They're just printing counterfeit $20 bills? I don't know. But nobody ever stopped building those permanent bases, and we let the ball drop. That's our obligation. That's one of the things. Congress did one good thing, and then they let it drop. So we've got to take responsibility for fighting back against that one. Then we're going to have 70,000 other troops permanently deployed. The New York Times, the Washington Post, all these leaks from the Baker-Hamilton Commission, they all say, everybody agrees, nobody's talking about bringing home all the troops. Well, excuse me, Mr. President, we are. We're still saying, bring all the troops home now. There's been a lot of debate going on within the peace movement in the last couple of days as these leaks have started to come out. And again, these are leaks. We don't have all the details yet about what's going to be in this report. We do know it's not going to be taken all that seriously in the White House. But it is going to do a lot to shape some of the debate. So we do need to follow it and know how to respond. There's been a certain debate saying that now the shift is between keep the troops there and bring the troops home, which was the old debate, and that now the new debate is bring the troops home now or bring them home in a gradual way over a long time, phased withdrawal. The problem is, as I read it, nobody's talking about phased withdrawal. They're talking about phased partial withdrawal of a very small number of troops, leaving all the rest there. And of those that are, quote, withdrawn, some of them may be brought home, but more of them are more likely to be put on other bases in other countries in the region, on ships over the horizon, which means you can't see them. That's that nice naval term, ships over the horizon. Means they're not visible with the naked eye from the people on shore, so they might not fight back as much. That's that idea. Or bases in Qatar, or in Kuwait, or somewhere else in the region. This is not bringing the troops home. This is not phased withdrawal. This is phased keep them there. So we need to be clear that what we're seeing is a change in the language of the debate, and that's very important. We need to take advantage of that, we need to seize on it, and push it forward. But we cannot have illusions. The Baker-Hamilton plan is not a plan for ending the war. The 3 plans commissioned by the Bush White House, one for the Pentagon, one for the State Department, and one for the National Security Conference, National Security Council, are also not plans for ending the war. They are plans for reducing U.S. casualties at the inevitable cost of a rise in Iraqi casualties, which they will not talk about, because unfortunately one of the ways in which we have not done our work well enough yet, we've made gains. We've made gains. Our peace movement has put Iraqi lives at the top of our agenda. And that's very important. It's not something that has always been true in anti-war movements in this country. Military Families Against the War has made that a principle to talk about Iraqi lives along with the lives of U.S. soldiers. The rest of us have done it as well, but not enough. We haven't done it enough. The result is that rising Iraqi casualties does not yet call into question the legitimacy of the war the way a rise in US casualties does. And that's a problem. That's a problem of racism and national xenophobia and a few other things that we need to do some serious work on. So we need to see this as a moment when these things are changing. But we need to claim the high ground. Remember, the guys that are getting all the credit right now are the people who were for the war, it was the right thing to do, overthrowing dictators, but Rumsfeld did it wrong. The military did it wrong. You know, these are the people, and then a few that are saying, well, I thought the war was right, but if I had known then what I know now, I would have said it was wrong. And they're getting huge amounts of credit. They're like the new heroes. Well, let them be heroes. I don't really care. But I do care that those of us who from day one before the war said this war is wrong, it's illegal, it's going to make things worse for Iraqis, worse for US troops, it's going to destroy whatever shreds of credibility US people and policy have anywhere else in the world. We were right. We were right from the beginning. We are the real heroes, not these people who now have decided to change. But we have learned some other things. We knew that this war was wrong. It was a violation of international law right from the beginning. And we knew right from the beginning that this was going to cause what we started from the beginning calling dual occupations. The occupation of Iraq by US troops is now existing in parallel with the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land. And we're seeing the occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, in a new way, partly because we're learning about what occupation means. I don't think there's much to be gained in trying to do point-by-point comparisons of which occupations are worse. I think military occupation is always terrible. The form of it changes, the kinds of weapons the occupying force uses differ in different eras at different times. What the French used in Algeria is not the same as what the French used in Indochina. What the US used in Vietnam is not the same as what the US uses in Iraq. What Israel uses in the West Bank and Gaza today is not the same as what they used in Sinai in 1967. But military occupation is always bad. The people living under it always hate it, and there is always resistance. The resistance also takes different forms at different times. Some of the resistance is legal, focused, targeted at the occupying military. Other times, desperation drives people to forms of resistance which are themselves illegal. International law is very clear. Resistance to military occupation is a legal right of all people. But not every act is a legal act of resistance. So I think for those of us who struggle with trying to figure out what do we think about occupation and resistance, whether it's Iraq or Palestine or anywhere else, whether it's the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara or Indonesia's occupation until 1999 of East Timor, we need to be clear about the illegality of occupation and clear about the right to resist occupation and clear that not every act is necessarily a legal act of resistance. I have no problem with saying that a suicide bombing against a military checkpoint in the occupied territories is a horrifying but legal act of resistance. Nor do I have a problem saying that a suicide bombing against a civilian target in Tel Aviv is an illegal act of resistance. I go on to say that if we're serious about stopping those kinds of horrific attacks, we need to be serious about understanding what causes them, what drives them, and use that terrible, threatening term, root causes. But that doesn't mean I will embrace it. So I think that's where we start when we're looking at occupation and resistance. One of the things that I think we've learned in this period of changing public opinion about Iraq is that more and more people understand that you cannot separate US policy in Iraq from US policy in the rest of the region. The U.S. support for Israeli occupation is the single most important answer to the question so often asked with such naivete at best: why do they hate us? Now, we don't have to get into all the problems that that question engenders. Who's the we? Who's the they that we're talking about here? But people do ask that question. One of the most important is that we, United States tax dollars and United States governments working in our name, with or without our consent, pay for Israeli occupation. So when a Palestinian family in Gaza is attacked with rockets and 19 people are killed, 7 of them young children, 5 of them women, and 3 of them old men, and their neighbors look out after the attack and they see what kind of a missile it was. That it was a Hellfire missile made in the United States and sent to Israel under our laws, may be in violation of the Arms Export Control Act, but an act that our Congress refuses to enforce. They blame us, and they're right to blame us. They are right unless we say no. And we are saying no. We are saying no. And that's what has been so important. In June, when it will be 40 years of occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, there will be a global day of protest to say no to Israeli occupation. And those of us in the United States will be at the center of that call. It will be the same people who said no to dual occupations when we talk about Iraq and Israel-Palestine at the same time, because they are linked. We saw this summer in the war in Lebanon that Israel's war in Lebanon was linked to U.S. policy in Iraq, that the question of Iranian nuclear policy is linked to U.S. policy in Iraq that has so damaged U.S. credibility that the notion that the United States wants to convene a regional conference, a regional peace conference, has become a laughingstock in the region, because it used to be that every country in the region felt that if the U.S. called a conference, they'd have to go, because after all, the U.S. is the biggest and the toughest kid on the block, and they're the ones calling the shots in the region. Well, not so much anymore. And it used to be that every neighbor of Israel lived in fear not only of Israel's nuclear weapons, but of its conventional weapons. And what happened? No government was ever willing to stand up against those Israeli assaults over its borders. And then suddenly it was Hezbollah, which, unfortunately from my vantage point, because I'm not so fond of what Hezbollah stands for, but the reality is, and we must understand reality as it is and not as we wish it to be, Hezbollah has emerged as the most popular political force in the entire Middle East. In Lebanon, it is the most popular among Christians as well as Muslims. Not all Christians, obviously. There's a huge split in Lebanon. But the demonstrations that you saw on your television screens yesterday, hundreds of thousands of people. And did you notice the women? Most of them were not veiled, which means most of them were not poor Lebanese who came from the villages. Most of them are urban women, including many Christian women. Were making up a large part of those hundreds of thousands that were in the street supporting the Hezbollah call for challenging the pro-US government in Beirut. Now, this is a very dangerous moment, because the danger of Lebanon's government splitting is a very real one. The danger of the political divide that we're seeing take such a violent form in Iraq as a result of the US invasion and occupation could also happen in Lebanon. There are serious dangers. The US has made the entire region less safe. The US war in Iraq has made every American less safe, and every person who lives in this country less safe. This war has been a disaster for everybody. And if we're serious about ending the war, we have to be serious about looking at the U.S. policy that stands at the root of this war. And that is the three-part Middle East policy that has been in effect since 1967. Oil, stability and military power, and Israel. Those three things have been the cornerstones of U.S. policy since 1967, when at the height of the Cold War, the U.S. looked at this region where its former colonial competitors, Britain and France, were pulling out, where Israel had trounced Arab armies in the Six-Day War, and the U.S. military looked at Israel's military and said, you know, we could do business with these people. We could use this military clout. And for those years following the 67 war, Israel became very much a cat's paw of U.S. policy, not only in the region, but throughout the world, in places as far-flung as Angola and Mozambique and El Salvador and Chile and Guatemala. Places all around the world where Israeli weapons sales and Israeli trainers for U.S.-backed militaries became the norm. But we are living in a different world now. The Cold War is long over. The aftermath of the first Gulf War is long over. This is no longer Washington's moment in the Middle East. And I think that we need to take advantage of that. We are going to hear in the future days, particularly with the Baker-Hamilton report about to come out, we're going to be hearing a lot about diplomacy. My sense is that the Baker-Hamilton report, and for those of you who are more interested in some of the details, I just wrote a piece about this that you can see at the IPS website or on some of the other websites around. They're going to spend much more emphasis on the diplomatic side than on the military side. What they call for militarily will be what I said earlier, a shift, but not an end to the military occupation by any stretch of the imagination. The focus will be on the diplomacy. Now, diplomacy is good. It's always better to talk than fight. But let's be clear. What's the basis for the diplomacy? Is it real diplomacy that has a chance to solve some of these problems? Unfortunately, I think the answer to that very easily is no, not a chance. They're talking about to Iran and Syria. Well, that's certainly better than isolating Iran and Syria. You know, why are we not surprised in the United States that we don't really have a clue at the official level what's going on in Iran? There hasn't been a U.S. diplomat in Iran since 1979, except when they went undercover carrying cakes and keys to start the Iran-Contra scandal. But aside from that, there has not been a U.S. diplomat sent to Tehran since 1979. Why are we not surprised that we don't know anything about what's going on? You know, so yes, it's good that people want to talk to Iran. It's good that they want to engage with Iran on the question of Iraq and the question of the region. But why in the world will Iran feel any compulsion to talk to us? And I'm using us here carefully. Why should they want to talk to the United States if the United States' position is that what we will give you, Iran, is the right to talk to us in return for you giving us, before you talk to us, a complete halt to your uranium enrichment program, an agreement to pull out your influence from Iraq. Apparently only the United States is the only foreign country allowed to have influence in Iraq, and a host of other demands. And Iran will look at it and say, you know what? Why should we do that? The only basis for negotiating with Iran on their nuclear enrichment program, something that is, unfortunately in my view, all around the world, legal under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is to call for a nuclear weapons-free zone throughout the Middle East. No exceptions. That's something that all the Arab countries have called for. And ironically enough, it's something, even beyond that, that's already official U.S. policy. You'll never hear about it from a U.S. diplomat. But if you read Article 14 of Resolution 687, that ended the Gulf War in 1991, you will see an explicit statement of support for what is known as a weapons of mass destruction-free zone throughout the Middle East. The U.S. wrote that resolution. They signed it. It's now law. It's U.S. law. We have to enforce it. But until there is a region-wide nuclear weapons-free zone or weapons of mass destruction-free zone, why would any country in the region, knowing that Israel is the only country with a nuclear arsenal. Why would any other country give up that right? The problem is, throughout the world, and this is where we have to look again at US policy in the Middle East in the context of global policy. The sense in Washington and in the other capitals of the so-called official nuclear powers that happen to be the 5 permanent members of the Security Council is that every other country that signs the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has obligations. The obligation is never to try and get a nuclear weapon. And sometimes we don't have any obligations. We nuclear weapons countries can have our nuclear weapons. Every other country agrees not to. Well, it didn't work that way. Those 180 or so other countries who signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, they thought they were getting something in return. Not just 5 permanent nuclear powers, now 8, when you add Israel, India, and Pakistan, but the agreement that those nuclear powers were going to move towards full and complete nuclear disarmament. You can't have non-proliferation without disarmament. And as long as the United States refuses to give up its own nuclear weapons, no other country is going to. So we have a huge job to do here. And I think that when we look at the region as a whole, the region is in flames. And that's not a good thing. People in the region are facing more oppression, war, poverty, unemployment, imprisonment in cantons, very similar to the Bantustans. It's not a coincidence that Jimmy Carter's book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, has engendered the massive debate that it has. The US campaign to end Israeli occupation, which has a table outside, at its last conference in Detroit a few months ago, agreed that the framework for all of our work against the occupation and for equal rights for all the UN resolutions, international law, the right of return, all those rights should be taken up in the context of understanding Israeli policy towards the Palestinians as a policy of apartheid. It's not a coincidence that all around the world, the strategy of BDS is the chosen strategy of those working against Israeli occupation. Boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. The same nonviolent pressure techniques that were used so successfully in the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa, that played such a big role in helping the South Africans themselves bring down the apartheid regime. Nonviolently, internationally. Internationalism is at the root of it. That's the kind of global strategy that we need. It's what we are a part of. U.S. Labor Against the War, United for Peace and Justice, all the host of organizations, Military Families Speak Out, Gold Star Families for Peace, all of us are part of a global anti-war movement. We're part of the second superpower, but boy, do we have a long way to go to make real in it. Thank you.
Now at this point, why don't we open the mics for starting with questions. And let's keep these to actual questions. And then when the questions are done, we will have comments. Let's limit it to a minute, if you could, so we can get a bunch of people out there. And you direct your questions to Phyllis, and if somebody has some questions for me, that's fine too. But go ahead, Nancy.
Nancy Gomer, AFT 2334, the professional staff, Congress of CUNY. Phyllis, thank you so much. As always, you're clear, you're strong, you give us a lot of good information that we need to take back. U.S. Labor Against the War is beginning a process of addressing some of the issues around Israel, Palestine, Lebanon that has always been the elephant in the living room. In my own union, it's just a constant battle because we want to be able to raise these issues, and it's used as a weapon against any progressive leadership or action in the union. So we are dedicating ourselves, U.S. Labor Against the War, to a process of introducing these ideas, facing these ideas. I don't think I could go to my union and start with divestment, obviously. I'd like to hear some ideas that you have of what has been a useful approach with American unions or American people in dealing with these issues? Thank you.
Okay, is this on?
Yeah.
It's a great question. I'm very, very glad that U.S. Labor Against the War is taking up this issue. Some of you were on a teaching conference call thing that we did a few months ago, which I think I had a very fun time doing it. And I think it was useful for folks on the call. But what I think is very impressive with U.S. law is your recognition that education has to come first. That we can't just sort of say, ooh, we sort of haven't dealt with this issue all these years, and now we're going to start it. We're going to start by polarizing everybody and insist on resolutions first. That's probably not so useful. I think that the education part is what's really important. Now, how to do that, there's, I think, a bunch of ways. I think that there's a lot of organizations, some of which are members of, for example, the U.S. Campaign to End Israeli Occupation, which is a coalition of about 240 or 250 member organizations all around the country, some of which are small local groups and some are big coalitions. But there's a lot of good resources there to start with. If you go to the resource section of that website, which is endtheoccupation.org, there's fact sheets. You'll see some of them out at the table. There's fact sheets. We're just launching some new resources on the anti-apartheid framework, including some posters that are very powerful with the link between South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid. So there's a lot of good resources out there. There's a lot of good speakers. It might be that in your unions, some version of that kind of teach-in would be a useful thing to do. I would imagine that in most cases, people will insist on having what they like to call sort of both sides or something, which is fine. In my experience, it's usually more useful to do that in separate events. But that's obviously a tactical question that's up to each union and each grouping. But I think some of the organizations, there's a number of Jewish anti-occupation organizations who have some ties with some Israeli trade union. There's a couple of small trade union groups in Israel, not the main Histadrut trade union, but some small individual union and unionists who have played a very important role in building the anti-occupation movement inside Israel, who might also be good resources for that. But I think we have to recognize that this is a very difficult question for a number of reasons. One is that it's not just about U.S. policy and the decisions of the Pentagon and the White House, and it's not just about the various pro-Israeli lobbies, and there are several. It's also about the educational system in the U.S., it's about media coverage, it's about popular culture, all of which is shaped, in my view, by a very, very strong pro-Israeli set of assumptions that start with Israel is like us, which also, among other things, there's a very racialized character to that. It's based on this idea that Israelis are all white, when in fact, putting aside the 20% of Israelis who are Palestinians, something about, I forget the exact number, but I think somewhere about 45% of Israeli Jews are actually Arabs. They're Jews from Morocco and from Yemen and from Egypt. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there. But the point is that we grow up in this country with a lot of assumptions about Israel. So we have to understand that we're not just talking about giving people some information about an issue they don't know anything about. We're talking about undoing years of often wrong information that people grow up with and hold on to as a very powerful thing. Those of us, I know from my own youth growing up Jewish and in a very active Zionist movement and stuff, it's very powerful stuff that you grow up with, and it's not always easy to make those breaks. So we have to take it slow, be patient, and see everything we do, whether it's a protest of a particular atrocity, whether it's a congressional campaign, whether it's a teach-in, all of it is about education.
Yes, I would like to ask, why did the UN Security Council vote unanimously this week to extend the U.S. mandate in Iraq for another year?
Yeah. The U.S. Security Council, in most cases, is very much at the beck and call of the United States. That's something that's sometimes under challenge, but not regularly and not without massive global mobilization at the level of both people and governments. this was not one of those moments. In fact, one of the ironies is they sneaked through that vote. The vote was not on the agenda until December 31st. The U.S. and the British managed to get it on the agenda without ever having put it on the published agenda that's published each month for the Security Council program. And ironically, the vote was taken 24 hours before the planned release of the executive summary of a massive new report which is about to be released in January by the Global Policy Forum and a number of other organizations, documenting with enormous comprehensive detail the international law violations of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. Now, whether it was designed to undercut that is not so clear. We're not sure they actually knew that it was about to be released. It's certainly possible they knew. But it was a sneak attack, essentially, to make sure that it was passed without discussion. It's particularly damaging and outrageous because just before that, the Iraqi parliament had debated, and a vast majority, I don't know if it was an actual resolution that was passed, but in the discussion in the Iraqi parliament, the overwhelming majority of people had set out a set of conditions that were their bottom line, that if the United Nations was going to extend the mandate of the so-called multinational force, which is the US-controlled occupation force in Iraq, it would only be acceptable to Iraqis if certain conditions were met. Those being that it be renewed every 6 months rather than every year, that Iraqi officials rather than US officials had control over the deployment of the troops, and a number of other conditions like that. None of those conditionalities were included. So it's quite an outrageous example, once again, of the abuse of the UN by the US and the British in this case.
Yes. I have a question about the apartheid language. I mean, I certainly understand the metaphor and understand what it's about and how one could think that it's appropriate. But I saw some language in the document that came for promoting the 40th anniversary events in June commemorating the occupation that quoted a UN formulation or definition of apartheid, which basically said it's the oppression of by one racial group of another racial group, which is something which resonates obviously from South Africa, but it doesn't resonate so obviously in the Middle East because it's not clear who the races are.
Right.
You know, are the Jews a race? Are the Palestinians a race? Are the Israelis a race? And then when you really get down into it, how helpful is the apartheid language beyond some broad metaphor?
Yeah, this is a very important question, what Mike just raised. And I think it's important on two levels. One is the metaphor is very, very important, I think, because it conjures up images that are very powerful, that are not otherwise conjurable, if you will, when we talk about Israel-Palestine. And it's precisely because it has such resonance. I mean, let's be frank, that's why Carter's book is getting such opposition. It's because of what a powerful image that is to use the term. But clearly, we can't just use it lightly. We have to have it grounded in this case, in international law. Now, you're right. That part of the language, and I actually think that's not the best part of the Convention Against Apartheid to quote, because it does use the language of a racial group. What's more important, I think, in the UN Covenant Against the Crime of Apartheid is that it exists. There is something called an international crime of apartheid, which was explicitly drafted in language that said, this is not just about South Africa and Namibia. This is a crime that has to do with one group oppressing another, systematic, and it goes through in great detail the kinds of acts which, if done for the purpose of, I don't remember the exact language, but it says something like improving the lives of the superior group and damaging the lives of the oppressed group, something like that. It's all kinds of examples: imprisonment, impoverishment, denial of cultural life, a whole series of things. Very much what happened in South Africa, but identical to what's happening in the Palestinian territories and inside Israel in terms of many aspects of that discrimination. So I think it is a very useful one. We have to learn to use the language right. We have to learn more about that that convention. I'll just tell you one quick anecdote and then we should go on. I know we don't have too much time. I spoke briefly to somebody who had worked rather closely with Carter on his book, and who had said that he didn't think, he had opposed using the title because he thought it just, there were certain differences and he didn't want to have that discussion, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, that's sort of interesting. It seems to me that actually if you look at the language of the International Convention Against the Crime of Apartheid, blah, 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 and his answer was sort of, yeah, right. And it was clear to me he didn't know there was an international covenant against the crime of apartheid. He was thinking, his conception of it was South African apartheid, which is, of course, the visual image and the experiential image that we all have. But there is an international covenant that makes those acts for the purpose of allowing one group to oppress another group illegal. That's what we have to learn to use and make it powerful.
I want to throw one other very important piece into the mix, which hasn't been mentioned yet, and that is anti-Semitism. I think that one of the unique factors in Israel here is that it is a country that was founded as a result of genocide against a people, and massive worldwide anti-Semitism, of which our country was very much a part of. We look at the history of the 30s. Now, that's not to argue that it was a good solution, but nonetheless, in the minds of the world, and in the minds of the Jewish people of the world, but not just the Jewish people of the world, Jews were being massively slaughtered, and Israel was a state that was a salvation for the Jews. Very different than a lot of other, say South Africa, the origin, and other kinds of states. So it's very central. The whole issue of anti-Semitism has been very central to the founding of Israel. If you look at sort of popular discussion, and the left makes a lot of mistakes on this, and speaking of somebody on the left and also somebody who's Jewish, that first of all, the fact that not all Jews are Israelis. And in the popular conversations about this in the world, Israel is referred as the Jewish, as sort of Jewish people. All Jewish people are lumped into all Israelis, right? All Jews don't agree with the Israeli government. In the United States, Phyllis, myself, there's lots of Jews that are leaders of the opposition to the policy of the Israeli government. All Israeli Jews don't agree with the Israeli government. In fact, the dialogue inside of Israel is incredible. The dialogue is much more active by many times inside of Israel around Israeli policy than it is inside the Jewish community in the United States, where it's really difficult, let alone as a Christian, as a Jew, to go into the Jewish community and say any of the things that Phyllis said without a good security contingent. Really, I've experienced those kind of battles myself. But that also, the fact is that anti-Semitism is still a very live force in the world. In the United States, synagogues are still being burned in Europe, and in the minds of many Jews, and in the minds of many of their allies, it wasn't that long ago where 6 million Jews were killed. My grandparents were both thrown down a well in Russia in a pogrom in the early 20th century. My wife's and my parents I grew up secular. My wife's family, her grandfather was killed when the Nazis took over took over Austria, and her grandmother was put in a concentration camp and died, and on and on and on, and her family, she was raised secular. We're both very critical of Israel, but anti-Semitism is in the bones of the Jewish people, and it's very integral in the world, and I'm saying that, not to say that, therefore, we can't talk about this policy, but I can tell you, as somebody who understands this from both sides, that if we don't talk about this with the sensitivity of the reality of anti-Semitism in the world and in the recent history, we will never succeed in not only changing the Jewish community, but in changing, for example, the labor movement, the roots in the 20th century labor movement include many critical Jewish leaders who were integral into the formation of the labor movement, and even today disproportionately play a role in the labor movement and are really sensitive to this. So it's not just a matter of having the correct line, it's figuring out how to be able to communicate with folks around this that see the world in a different way.
Let me just add one quick thing to that. That's very important. And just as a resource, Haaretz newspaper, which is the sort of key daily newspaper, the sort of New York Times of Israel, which has an English language website, is one of the best sources. I rely on it a lot. And it's very credible. And the issue of credibility and sensitivity in terms of what are our sources for making the statements we do is very important, and I recommend that one.
Okay, I'm going to limit this. We got 5 people up there. Let's have everybody ask their question or comment. And I'm going to have to, we got 5 minutes left, so let's sort of try and move through the last piece pretty quickly. I'm sorry, but we got to get to dinner. Go ahead.
I'd like to go back to Iraq and look at the analysis, the very interesting analysis you gave of the changing tactics, the shifts, once it's clear that the original U.S. strategy has failed in Iraq. My question is, don't you think there's a danger of underestimating the U.S. ruling class at this point? That the wounded beast may well be more dangerous than the U.S. under the regime of Bush and the neocon advisors? That the Democrats, as a war party, have a very interesting kind of program to win more popular allegiance, more patriotic allegiance to a war policy by stressing themes like sacrifice, like national service, and so forth. That the shift towards diplomacy is really just another tactic in a very settled war policy there. I mean, I'd like you, for example, to comment on Richard Haas's article in Foreign Relations, I'm sure you've read it, which he calls for diplomacy, but says specifically, the reason for putting more emphasis on diplomacy is because then people are more easily persuaded to support military intervention if diplomacy does not work. So coercive diplomacy is simply a military tactic. It's a political tactic to win allegiance for more military intervention. You see the drift I'm going in, and my last part of this question is, don't we need a clear, concrete, fresh explanation of imperialism here? This has been a word. I think we don't need to recite the word. Don't you think we need a fresh, clear analysis of imperialism to understand the shifts of tactics?
Can you give a concise answer?
Just quickly, I think that, I mean, I wrote a book called Challenging Empire. I use the word empire instead of imperialism because I think more people understand it. But I think, yes, I think diplomacy is being used as part of the coercive tactic. That was pretty much what I said, that was why they're doing it. So.
What I think we'll do now is let the last 4 people speak, and then Phyllis make final comments. 1 minute each. Yeah, 1 minute each. Go ahead.
Last year in Los Angeles on March 18th, on the 3-year anniversary of the war, being generous, about 10,000 people marched. 2 weeks later, probably the largest march in American history, 2 million people hit the streets over the Immigrant Rights March. I'm wondering in which ways we can combine the two forces there, in particularly detailing the same forces of imperialism that drive people to have to flee other countries. U.S. imperialism forcing people to flee other countries for escaping all kinds of horrors and looking for work, and the same kind of imperialist exploitation that's happening in Iraq. In which ways can we join those forces and really bring into the center the fight against racism and the fight against imperialism, and learn something from that boycott, or what was really a strike on May 1st, which shut down the docks, which shut down the fields, which shut down the schools. In which ways can we go back to our locals and start to talk about a strike against the war?
Okay. Steve, go ahead.
I'm often confused about why Israel does what it does. I wonder, sometimes it just seems like retribution back and forth, and I'm confused because it seems like their policy is almost like suicidal. It just doesn't really achieve their goals. And I'm wondering how the people in Israel on the street think about this issue. And is it Israel that's controlling U.S. policy in the Middle East, or are they just taking marching orders from Washington?
Thank you. Okay.
I'm David Macco, chairman of the Libertarian Party of Northeast Ohio. Other than stopping all foreign aid to everywhere and bringing all of our troops home from everywhere, not only the Middle East, but Korea, Japan, Germany, England, the other 120 countries, do you have any ideas at all of how to prevent World War III?
Next comment.
Yes, you stated that the U.S. is the cause of the violence in Iraq, and I agree with you. But it does seem that most of the violence occurring now in Iraq is actually Iraqis against Iraqis rather than Iraqis resisting the U.S. occupation. So I'm just trying to figure out, how do we explain this to Americans who are questioning whether immediate withdrawal is really such a the best policy. Okay, so Phyllis, these were all easy ones.
Well, the big question is, how do we build a movement? That sort of is at the root of most of these. There's a particularity around Israel. I don't think that Israel is under U.S. control, and I don't think it controls U.S. foreign policy. I think Israel is not as powerful a country as the United States, and it depends on the United States for a great deal of support, both financial, military, and diplomatic. But it is very much an independent operator in the region and in the world, and does not always agree with the U.S., although they have strategic parallels. The other is really about building a movement. The struggle against racism and anti-Arab racism has emerged as a key component globally, but certainly in this country, when we look at who's on the front lines of the civil liberties, stripping away of our civil liberties that we're facing, it's Arabs and Muslims. How do we take it up in our movement? When we look at, well, we have to have a big demonstration. Well, we have to recognize that Arabs and Muslims, even if they're legal immigrants, face a much higher risk than native-born citizens who are not Muslims, who are not Arab Americans, if they should get arrested at a demonstration. And we need to take that very seriously, so that a bigger demonstration is not always the answer. Civil disobedience may be an appropriate target at various moments, but we have to understand who pays a bigger price in terms of immigrants, and particularly immigrants of color, and most especially Muslim and Arab immigrants. So all of these things have to do with how we build a movement. At the end of the day, our movement is much more than marches. Marches are important, but they are, the word demonstration, I think, is right. They are demonstrating something that exists. The importance of February 15th was that it was demonstrating global opposition to this war. That's what was so important about it. It was showing something other than itself. It's not just about how many people can we get into the streets this day. It's what do people understand is our obligation as people who live in the wealthiest country in the world, the most powerful country in the world, the most nuclearized country in the world, the country that is intervening most militarily around the world and doing the most damage to the environment and to people around the world. What is our obligation? And that's where we get to organizations like U.S. Labor Against the War. It's going to be different in every union. It's going to be different in every local. It's going to be different in U.S. Labor Against the War than in Military Families Against the War. It's going to be different in Code Pink than in Women's Strike for Peace. It's going to be different in Black Voices for Peace than in, you get my point. All of these parts of our movement are crucial. Those of us in the mainstream peace movement that has historically been predominantly white have done pretty good at reaching out at the leadership levels to organizations of color, communities of color, but we have not done the work within our own movement. We have not brought an anti-racist centrality to that movement. And that's the key. If we're serious about being part of the global movement, we need to start by being part of the movements of this country, whether it's the immigrant rights movement, whether it's the largely African-American-led movement around Katrina. If we look at the three movements that have been most in motion over the last 3 years, it's the Latino-led immigrant rights movement, the African-American-led Katrina aftermath movement, and the predominantly white peace movement. Those are thoroughly segregated movements. But what power if they were able to come together? What we would be able to say to the rest of the world, look at us, we are the real America. It's not what you see on television. We are the real Americans. And then, when we go to Congress and say, yeah, you damn well are going to listen to us, it's a whole different ballgame.
Let me say on the question about Iraq and the impact of the occupation, that we have tonight Samir Abil, who is probably presents the best opportunity you'll have to actually get to ask questions about what the Iraqi point of view is. And I want to also say that in the Christmas season, when everyone's out shopping, that we have two really outstanding presents for people. One is this really excellent tour of 25 cities of the Iraqi trade unionists speaking to workers, meeting face-to-face, that was produced by U.S. Labor Against the War, and several lengths and different versions of it. It's a tremendous way to get a conversation going in your workplace and in your union. And more current and in the season are these solidarity cards. Join hands for peace, Iraqi working people and U.S. working people. Create bonds of international labor solidarity. This is a card that was produced by U.S. Labor Against the War that is done as part to raise funds for the Iraqi labor movement. There is a progressive working class labor movement, democratic movement in Iraq that we can support. In addition to all the crazy stuff that's happening, we should support it. You can actually do that right now by buying some gifts for your friends in the hands of these cards. And with that, I'd like to say I'd like to thank Phyllis for the fantastic